So after Max Verstappen took advantage of Mercedes taking a page out of Ferrari's book to win his home Grand Prix, we were off to Italy for the second time this year and to Monza, home of the Italian Grand Prix. Mid last year providing the first McLaren win in 170 races, though after the pace this year it turns out they may have to wait 170 races for another one. The race at Monza though is an incredibly historic one and means more than any other to Ferrari and their fans, so I can't wait to see how they'll throw it away this time. Coming into the weekend, Max Verstappen had extended his championship lead to 109 points, with Red Bull also atop the constructors, with Ferrari sat in second place, now just 30 points ahead of Mercedes. If only there were a couple of times this year where they could have bagged just a couple more points. Further back, and after a few good races, the Aston Martin team had close to just 4 points behind AlphaTauri. Well, I'd say Aston Martin, it's more like Sebastian Vettel, given he currently has 4 times the amount of points as teammate Lance Stroll. I guess though, when it comes to Canadian F1 drivers, it could be worse. Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to round 16 in Italy. Before we get going, just a quick reminder that if you do enjoy, to give the video a thumbs up and get yourself subscribed for more weekly F1 content. Now, with that out of the way, let's get into my honest review of Formula 1 and the 2022 Italian Grand Prix. Coming into the weekend, and it was AlphaTauri grabbing the headlines, not because of their performances, but because of their drivers, with the team stating that they would be signing IndyCar driver Colton Herta for 2023, if the FIA would grant him a super license. And with the American being the team's first choice, it kinda just feels like a massive slap in the face to all 5 Red Bull juniors currently in F2. But why would AlphaTauri need to bring in another driver, I hear you ask? Well, that's because Pierre Gasly is currently the front runner to replace Fernando Alonso at Alpine, which should be fun considering Ocon and Gasly supposedly have a relationship so bad that it rivals a 2021 Haas car. Over at Ferrari, and the team had been making the trip from Zandvoort down to Monza in preparation for the weekend's race, but it went as well as the rest of the season with the truck breaking down on their way, as it seems the battle for title of most unreliable is no longer between F1 teams, but a fierce inter-department fight at Ferrari. And not wanting to miss out on some fun, the marketing department had some new designs for the team wear this weekend, with Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz showing off a yellow and black look given the team had decided to turn them into a pair of minions for the weekend. Though I guess it is fitting that if they were made to look like characters from a film, it would be from a comedy masterclass. And lastly, with the Ferrari yellow was a new livery for the weekend, and while we all hope for something like this, what we actually got was the current F175 car with a smudge of yellow on the engine cover. Into the first session, a Mercedes reserve, Nick de Vries, was picking up FP1 outings as if he was collecting Pokemon cards, with the Dutch driver and Aston Martin having already had sessions this year with Williams and Mercedes. Honestly, this guy is just doing the F1 equivalent of using a different email address to get free trials. But he wasn't the only one, as over at Haas we had Antonio Giovinazzi filling in for Mick Schumacher. Across the grid, engine penalties for multiple drivers were emerging, given Monza tends to be a more ideal place to take them, with one of those drivers being Lewis Hamilton after his engine didn't survive being sent into the Spa tarmac like an Undertaker chokeslam. Others included Carlos Sainz with a host of penalties taking him to the back of the grid, with Max Verstappen also picking up 5 places for an ICE change. Over at AlphaTauri, and Yuki Tsunoda had a 10-place penalty, not for engine components but for having received 5 reprimands this season, the FIA effectively making him the first this year to get a slap for poor driving. How Nicholas Latifi didn't get it before him, I'll never know. Out on track and at McLaren, Lando Norris was having a little battle with Max Verstappen, getting in front of the Red Bull round Parabolica and sorta well impeding Max a bit on his lap. Though in fairness, practice is the only chance Lando gets to race at Red Bull, so I can't really blame him. At Mercedes, and Russell was having trouble getting the car slowed down into turn 1. I'm no expert, but I believe the brake pedal should help with that one. And rounding out the session was a trip through the gravel for Nick de Vries, just a little too keen to impress people, though in fairness Stroll was in the other car, so it's not exactly tough competition. Into FP2 and early on in the session, both Carlos Sainz and Mick Schumacher were struggling at turn 2, cutting across the runoff having carried a bit too much speed into the first turn. But cutting turn 2 isn't just a fun activity for underperforming drivers, as Max Verstappen found himself doing the same, the Dutchman electing to cut the turn instead of launching it off the sausage curb like last year. Halfway through, and if it's not the Ferraris themselves dying, then it's Ferrari customer teams, as Mick Schumacher ground to a halt by the side of the track and brought out the red flag. But as we headed to the end of Friday's running, it was Valtteri Bottas heading off into the gravel, going wide out of the Lesmos twice after the Finn heard a rumour he could find a reliable car there. On to Saturday, and the big news came from the Williams garage as it was revealed Alex Albon would take no further part in the weekend. This was because the Thai driver had appendicitis and therefore required emergency surgery, so wishing him the speediest of recoveries. But that meant a seat needed filling, and after 2 years of trying, Nick de Vries would be given an F1 race, as it seemed all those FP1 free trials had finally paid off. Into the action though, and Carlos Sainz was getting in the way, and while the team would want him to be in Verstappen's way, it was only Valtteri Bottas, with the Spaniard impeding at turn 1 and earning himself a 4th reprimand, one more and it's a 10th-place grid penalty. Back at Williams, and de Vries was finally out on track after the late call in the morning. He was also very quickly off track and into the gravel, finding the limits of the Williams car. And let's be real, those limits aren't exactly that far from an F2 car. Into qualifying, and despite the fears it would be Verstappen domination, the Ferraris were looking decently quick. Further back, and in his first F1 qualifying session, Nick de Vries was already setting laps at the same pace of Latifi. I said that as if it was an achievement on Nick's part, but we all know it's just a case of pretty much any racing driver can beat Latifi. And that's exactly what happened, with de Vries through into Q2 and Latifi, well, kinda not. The Canadian too busy not stopping for turn 1. At least he wasn't last this time. That honour went to Mick Schumacher with Kevin Magnussen in 19th, the Haas team seemingly feeling nostalgic and missing their performances of last year. Into Q2, and after the first runs it was a Noah's Ark for the top 6, with Ferrari, then Red Bull and then Mercedes, with Leclerc needing 2 laps as he was busy doing an F1 driver's favourite thing and going deep at turn 1. Into the final runs though, and de Vries had a very real shot to get into the top 10. That shot ended at turn 4 when he locked the rears and had to cut across the chicane. And joining him out in Q2 were both Alfa Romeos, with Bottas in 12th and Zhou in 14th. I guess it's still better than their recent Q3 form though. Into the final session, and to start off, things were still looking rosy for Ferrari, with Sainz leading a 1-2 over the Red Bulls. In behind them was George Russell, who would theoretically be starting second if things ended as they were. On to the times that matter though, and first across the line was Carlos Sainz, improving his time and increasing the gap to Leclerc behind, to which Leclerc said, "That's cute," and proceeded to go 2.5 tenths quicker. But could Verstappen spoil the party and upset just about every single person at the track? Luckily for Ferrari, he couldn't, ending up P2, meaning that the Ferrari prodigy Leclerc was on pole for the team's home race. In behind, and with all sorts of grid penalties, it would leave George Russell in P2 with Lando Norris in P3, and Daniel Ricciardo up in P5. Seemingly all it took for a good qualifying for Ricciardo was half the grid taking penalties. So normally we'd head to lights out, but given the utter confusion and chaos that are F1 grid penalties, a few things needed sorting first, as even the teams and drivers had no clue where they would be starting the race. But here it is. Notables include Verstappen in 7th from 2nd, along with de Vries starting in the top 10 for his first ever race, and based on those start positions for the Williams pair, just make a guess at which one has 2.5 years F1 experience and which one has none. On to lights out, and it was a shocker for Lando Norris as he went into anti-stall and dropped 4 places off the line. Meanwhile at Red Bull, the world's most inevitable man was making progress, going from 8th to 4th on the opening lap, and then breezing by Daniel Ricciardo for 3rd before turn 1 on the 2nd lap of the race. But as the rest of the grid found out, breezing by Daniel Ricciardo was not the easiest of tasks, with the Australian becoming the driver of what may be F1's most textbook DRS train, holding up Gasly, Norris, Alonso, de Vries and Zhou, but at least he was in front of those cars instead of being behind as usual. And soon enough the train had a new passenger in the form of Carlos Sainz, as after starting 18th the Ferrari driver rocked up behind Zhou in 9th, and then quickly made his way past a few drivers, getting up into 4th place. Meanwhile over at Red Bull, after a poor start, Perez was climbing up from 16th, until he found himself dropping down the order thanks to an early pit stop. Not to mention the Mexican's front right brake producing more smoke than a heavy metal concert. But at least the issues weren't terminal, which was the case for Sebastian Vettel, with the Aston Martin having its paint scraped away to be revealed as an Alfa Romeo. But this brought out the VSC, which perked up the ears of the Ferrari strategy team, as they brought Leclerc in from the lead despite being a few seconds ahead of Verstappen. And to make the move even more, well, what was the point in that? The VSC ends with Leclerc still in the pits, meaning he came out and just narrowly avoided getting caught up in the Daniel Ricciardo express train. A few laps later, and one of the passengers on said express made an attempt to leave, with Gasly going down the outside at turn 1 and overshooting his braking by only like a good 20 metres. And having blown that opportunity to get past, AlphaTauri manufactured another by calling Pierre in for an undercut. That also didn't work, as 1 lap later, he was still behind Ricciardo. Fast forward a few laps and it was the turn of Carlos Sainz to pit, probably getting PTSD from both his bad stops in Zandvoort. But luckily this time Ferrari remembered that F1 cars have 4 wheels and not 3, and sent the Spaniard on his way, and when he came out he was behind Sergio Perez. Not to worry though, as after a nice move into turn 4 the Spaniard could continue making progress. One Spaniard not making progress though was Fernando Alonso, as the team called him in to retire the car. I guess at least he didn't have to sit in the Ricciardo train any longer. Over at Mercedes, and having made his way up the order, it was time for Hamilton to pit, coming out behind Danny Rick and friends, meaning he'd need to work his way through that pack. And with a nice switchback at turn 2, he was up past not just Pierre Gasly, but Lando Norris too. Turning our attention to the front, and Leclerc was making his second stop. And while he'd lose track position to Verstappen, he'd have soft tyres to chase the Dutchman down and take a historic win at Monza. I said he'd have soft tyres to chase the Dutchman down. Soft tyres to chase down. Okay, well, maybe he just had the soft tyres. And while Leclerc was trying to find where his pace had gone, our attention turned to what I'm calling Battle of the Drivers that looked to be losing their seats, with Mick Schumacher swapping positions with the number 6 Williams, and the German coming out ahead in the end. And if that wasn't bad enough for Latifi, while he was trundling around in 14th to 16th place, Nick de Vries on debut was still running up in 9th, as he hopped on the Danny Rick train on lap 1 and stayed there, well, forever. Well, I say forever, that was until Ricciardo's McLaren died on lap 47, bringing out the safety car, with Max Verstappen well out into the lead and the win looking all but sealed, and so the pack was bunched up and we were ready to go racing for a last lap showdown. Except for this one tiny little problem, called, what was it again? Ah yes, the rules. As with removing Ricciardo's car taking longer than expected, there weren't enough laps to have the safety car brought in. And while maybe in the past a certain someone in charge of the race would have just said, F it, the current race directors didn't, meaning Max Verstappen took the win behind the safety car, with Leclerc having to settle for P2 at Monza. And further back, given de Vries did finish in 9th place and picked up 2 points on debut, it meant Nicholas Latifi was back into 21st place in the 20 Driver Championship. Anyways, that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching. If you have enjoyed, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe for more F1 content. But until next time, take care.